Hello. Yesterday, I released a post over on Substack that discussed the US attack on Iranian enrichment facilities that we saw over the weekend. This now seems like it occurred years ago, even though it was a few days ago, because we've since had an Iranian attack on a US airbase in Qatar, a supposed ceasefire that Trump announced in the last day, and then both Israel and Iran have been seen to break that ceasefire. Trump then also dropped an F-bomb with reporters at the NATO summit. So, for today's episode, I'm going to start by discussing the US attack on Iran, and I may also dive into the other updates that we've seen since then, depending on time. So, before diving into anything, it's worth noting that on Friday, Seymour Hersh over on Substack predicted that this US attack would unfold over the weekend so that Trump didn't immediately impact the stock market. This unfolded in exactly the way that he predicted. Trump said last week that he would make a decision within 2 weeks on a potential Iran attack. This allowed everyone to breathe a temporary sigh of relief, thinking that we had 2 weeks to ponder the consequences. But this was seemingly all smoke and mirrors. Trump attacked Iran within 2 days of making these comments, and he had reportedly decided to do so on Wednesday before he even made these comments to the media. It's also worth noting that the exact exercise was practiced by the US and Israel last year. So for at least a year, it's been a consideration that we would one day potentially find ourselves in such a geopolitical environment in the Middle East as we do today. This attack by the US involved 125 military aircraft, the most important of which were the 7 B-2 stealth bombers. The attacks targeted 3 nuclear enrichment facilities in Iran: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Fordo is built into a mountain and is expected to sit 240 feet underground. As a result, this required the B-2 stealth bombers because they are the only aircraft that can carry GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bunker bombs. This fact alone likely played a large role in the United States deciding to get directly involved. The US could have given these bombs to Israel, but in that scenario, it's questionable if Israel could have done anything with them. This aerial operation by the United States was also veiled in misdirection. Early reports suggested that aircraft took off from the United States and headed west with the planned destination of Guam before potentially heading on to Diego Garcia, which is a base that the United States shares with the UK in the Indian Ocean. However, at the same time, aircraft also took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and headed east. According to a New York Times report, these aircraft were in the air for 37 hours non-stop, and they refueled several times in mid-air. It was these aircraft that headed towards Iran and launched the attacks that we saw on Sunday. The USS Georgia also launched 30 Tomahawk missiles at the nuclear enrichment facilities in Isfahan and Natanz. And it was the B-2 bombers that dropped 12 bunker buster bombs at Fordo, and also another 2 at Natanz. While the US operation was unfolding, they weren't attacked by the Iranians, and so after the attack, these planes turned around and they flew back to Missouri. There has been satellite imagery released by Maxar Technologies that shows the damage at all 3 facilities. Outside of these 3 facilities, during the clashes between Israel and Iran, we've also seen the Kondab Heavy Water Research Reactor hit on June 19th. and the Tehran Research Centre was also hit. It is clear that Iran's nuclear industry has taken a hit as a part of this conflict that's unfolded over the last few weeks. After this US attack, we were in a position where Iran was seemingly going to respond, as had been stated by the Iranian president. With an Iranian response expected, the next question was to determine what such a response could look like. This reminded me of a time during Trump's first term, where we saw him undertake the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. The Soleimani assassination had severe effects in both Iran and Iraq, where protests occurred against US influence in the Middle East. We also saw further after effects of this assassination last year in Iran, where 103 people were killed in a bomb blast in Kerman at an event for Soleimani. However, a key difference this time round was that the US directly hit Iran, whereas last time the hit on Soleimani happened in Baghdad in Iraq. But I still believed it was worth exploring how Iran responded back then. Back in 2020, they largely used their proxies, but they also launched missiles at the Al-Assad base in Iraq. Nobody was hurt in the US base from this attack, and from here we saw de-escalation. Today, Iran's proxies are weakened, so any attack from them would likely have a diminished impact on US assets in the Middle East. So this time we are in a different geopolitical environment, but I questioned whether we could see a similar Iranian response unfold this time round against the US. We did see the IRGC target Israel with 2 waves of ballistic missiles the morning after the US attack. And Iran also used intermediate range ballistic missiles for the first time to hit Ben Gurion Airport and Israel's Biological and Chemical Research Centre in Ness Ziona. But I questioned if Iran would respond directly to the United States attack. And the biggest conclusion I came to was that if this was to occur, it would likely be an attack against a US base in the Middle East. Last week, we saw that the United States was evacuating personnel, aircraft, and ships from bases on the Persian Gulf. Also, prior to the US attack, Iran stated that if the United States did get involved, that they would hit US bases in the Middle East. Based on this warning, it did seem that this would be the most likely scenario that we would see unfold. The ball would then end up back in the court of the United States, who would face a choice. They would either see an Iranian response as de-escalation, just as occurred in 2020, or the United States would launch yet another escalatory attack against Iran. So, the most important thing here was the characteristics of the Iranian response against US bases, which, based on their rhetoric, was expected. As we now know with hindsight, this did occur. This was a de-escalatory attack, and we saw in the last day Donald Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Based on the rhetoric from both sides, it was expected that this was how this event was going to unfold. But that's on a surface level of analysis. In issues such as this, that are so deep and complicated, we also have to look deeper. There is the potential that this entire scenario unfolded as part of a larger plan of geopolitical theatre and misdirection. One potential reason supporting this being a geopolitical performance was the activity that we saw around the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility in the days leading up to the attack by the United States. A number of trucks entered the facility in a move that could imply an evacuation of personnel or assets or preparation for the US attack. The Iranians have stated themselves that they moved all their assets in March. Regardless of whether Iran moved its assets in March, in the last few days when the queues of trucks were seen outside of Fordo, they were clearly preparing the facility in some way. It was reported that the trucks were carrying dirt that could have been used to attempt to limit the damage at the facility, especially around the entrances. In this case, if Iran has moved its assets and if they prepared the facility, the United States could have hit an empty facility at Fordo, and they could have caused very little damage with the bombs that they used if the facility was prepared for such an attack. We do see evidence on the surface of the mountain that shows that an attack very clearly did occur, as new holes have emerged on satellite imagery, as weapons clearly penetrated the ground around Fordo. But the damage inside this facility is unknown, and perhaps it never will be known. So, any damage at Fordo would obviously slow Iran's nuclear industry down, just as we've seen with the attacks at the other facilities. But if Iran's assets were relocated, a question that still remains today that could see this conflict spark once again in the future is, where were these assets moved to? Hence, this will likely boil down to Iran's nuclear industry becoming a lot more secretive in the future as a result of these attacks. In the short term, of course, as I've mentioned multiple times, Iran's nuclear industry will have been hurt by the latest war that we've seen. But in the long term, there are aspects of Iran's nuclear industry that bombs can't destroy. It was also reported by Trump's National Intelligence Director, Tulsi Gabbard, that Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon. But a few days after, we saw Trump state that Gabbard was wrong, and the United States launched this attack on Sunday anyway. A second potential characteristic of this attack that could imply that there is a bigger plan at play is that the United States reportedly warned Iran beforehand that attacks will be coming through its usual Swiss back channels. A potential warning is also supported by the evacuation of Fordo that we saw, unless Iran took this as a precaution. So, if a larger plot was at play here, and this was all performative, what would be its likely aim? The aim would likely to be to give everyone the off-ramp that they want. Firstly, one of the reasons that Israel launched this attack in the first place, as we discussed a few episodes ago, is that they wanted to destroy the Iranian nuclear capabilities and the potential towards Iran building a nuclear bomb, whether this was actually happening or not. This required the bunker buster bombs, and with the United States attack on Iran, we saw this occur. Also, the Israelis are spending a lot of money on this war, and they have also taken damage themselves. So they could also want to de-escalate, but Netanyahu has to maintain his strongman image, because the second reason that Israel launched this attack on Iran was for Netanyahu's own career. Because prior to this war, the Knesset was partaking in a vote of no confidence against Netanyahu's coalition. Through this war and the deal that he made with the ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties, Netanyahu maintained his coalition. So Netanyahu can't be seen to de-escalate, but through this attack, did the United States give Israel a way that it could paint this conflict as a success? If this batch of potential geopolitical theatre is the case, then this is what led me so strongly to believe that the Iranians would launch an attack at a US base where no casualties would occur. And then from here, we would see de-escalation. This ultimately unfolded in the last few days. And from here, it was expected that this conflict would die down. However, today we are seeing the news that both sides potentially broke this ceasefire. I'll finish with a final comment. There is so much happening here that it's very difficult to keep up. Yes, we can pursue deep levels of research to attempt to figure out what is going on here and to figure out what each side is saying. But when we are asked, where do we potentially go from here? The most truthful answer anybody can give is that we don't know. But in assessing these events, as we did in the aftermath of this US attack, we can better understand the incentives behind all the actors that are involved here. At least then, if we see specific scenarios unfold, as we did with the Iranian attack on the US airbase in Qatar and the de-escalation attempts that we saw with Trump announcing a ceasefire, we can then know the potential reasons as to why such a scenario did unfold. After the news that this ceasefire was broken, we are once again potentially in an environment where a lot of scenarios could unfold. I will dive into this on next episode, which will be released on Friday. Until then, I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.